This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Dorivar Ruiz Diaz, K-State Soil Fertility Specialist, begins the show as he explains the purpose of lime applications and the impact it can have for crops, specifically alfalfa and wheat. Continuing the show is Brian Arnall, Oklahoma State University Precision Nutrient Management Extension Specialist, discussing cutting input costs without losing yield. K-State professor and extension specialist Cheryl Boyer ends the show talking about her work in research, marketing, and extension programming. That and more is coming up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Thursday show discussing liming with K-State Soil Fertility Specialist Dorivar Ruiz Diaz. Dorivar, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.
Dorivar, why are we currently considering liming?
Yes, Shelby, this is a topic that's becoming more and more relevant for us in Kansas as we start to see more acidity developing in our soils. Kansas have a gradient of pH, really, if we go from east to west. We do have typically high pH in western Kansas, and in some cases the problem is really alkaline soils, high pH more than acidic soils. But then in the central and eastern part of the state, of course, we have more acid soils, especially south central. And even in western Kansas, we start to see some spots where low pH becomes an issue. And this is because of the farming practices. Obviously, the main source of acidity is fertilizer application, nitrogen application over time. So we are contributing to acidity in this process. And of course, over time, we'll start to see more low pH develop. So it is something that is becoming a bigger challenge. And in some cases, I see in recent years where it's possible that producers may not be expecting to see low pH problems, and suddenly that's becoming an issue, limiting growth, limiting yields, and sometimes becoming a pretty big issue in terms of even seeing aluminum toxicity in some cases. Again, just because we were not expecting in the past, and in recent years, it's just becoming more and more common.
Do we see soils quickly becoming too high in pH or low in pH, or is it a slow development?
That is something that depends on the soil type. One of the key factors is the CEC, the cation exchange capacity of that soil, basically the buffer of that soil. So typically, more sandier soils will change in pH much faster. And so acidity will tend to be more common usually in sandier soils because again, there's little buffer in that soil. But then on the flip side, more fine texture soil, medium texture soils, that change in pH, that acidity will happen much slower, but it still will obviously develop over time. On the flip side also, and this is where the solution to low pH is obviously lime application, the same thing will happen. You asked about increasing pH, and yes, the increase in pH will also be faster in those sandier soil because of that buffer is much smaller. So essentially, we need less lime to increase pH in sandier soils. But we actually will probably need a lot more lime to increase pH in those fine texture soil. Again, just how quickly that change in pH happens is different. So we need to lime more often those sandier soils. We need to pay more attention to those because that change in pH happens very quickly. We may not see that very often in fine texture soils. But when it comes to the time to applying lime application, we also have to keep in mind that those fine texture soils will probably need a lot more lime because that buffer is much higher. So that's basically reflected in your soil test. When you're looking at the soil test report, we do have the pH, and then we do have the buffer pH. And that is always a question I got from farmers is, okay, what is that buffer pH telling you? And that's really an indication of the buffer capacity of that soil. And that's really the number that we use to provide recommendation in terms of how many tons, how many pounds of lime we need to apply to correct that pH. So those are two key factors. There are two key numbers that we need to look at. And again, soils will be different depending on the buffer of that soil. The other thing to keep in mind and getting about potential implications for yields and plant growth development in general, one of the key factors that we need to pay attention as well as we're getting low in pH and we do see some of those acidic soils is the presence of aluminum in solution. And this is one test that we often also recommend if we have pH getting 5.5 or even lower than that. The question becomes how much aluminum is in solution. Because in reality, the issue is not really the pH. The issue causing problems is really aluminum toxicity. Remember, aluminum in the optimum pH is not going to be in solution. But once you have high aluminum content in solution, that becomes toxic and basically affecting root development. Okay, so roots are basically limited in growth. And that's the reason why when you see the symptom of low pH in the field, oftentimes you see kind of a droughty symptoms. Basically, plants are not be able to take water. Sometimes it looks like a little bit like phosphorus deficiency because, again, that roots is not accessing phosphorus and other nutrients. So it's the symptoms can be a combination of what seems to be water stress and nutrient deficiency because, again, that root development is being affected significantly. So that's typically the symptom that we tend to see there. So oftentimes when we're talking about pH of 5.5 and lower, that's where we start to see some aluminum toxicity, aluminum getting in solution. And when you get that aluminum of 25 part per million or higher, that's where we really have a problem. And we can start to see some toxicity problems and affecting yields and plant growth in general. Again, that's really the key factor there. If you, again, keep in mind, pH is really, we're talking about the activity, the concentration of hydrogen in the soil. But that itself is not really what's causing the problem. It's really that aluminum toxicity is really the main issue.
What's your recommendation for the timing of application of lime?
So what do we do about the low pH and of course, it's lime application? Timing is really a key factor because we do need enough time for the reaction to happen. Once we apply lime, we have the reaction of calcium carbonate with hydrogen, and again, we neutralize that acidity. That requires also moisture and require time. And so how much time? Usually the initial reaction happen in a window of about 4 to 6 weeks. That usually happen fairly quickly, especially if we do have good moisture. Now, if it is very dry, that lime may be just sitting there for longer. So that's something to keep in mind. And so we need the initial reaction usually happen in that window about 4 to 6 weeks. So we're thinking about, for example, planting, alfalfa or winter wheat this fall. This is the good time to do this because it will give us good time for that lime to react and provide benefit by later this fall, especially for winter wheat. We are planting, say, mid-October, then that pH will be in that optimum range already. So it's an ideal time to do that right now. But again, keep in mind that this is required time and the reaction will continue to happen, again, depending on moisture content. So we need to plan ahead for sure when we're thinking about lime application.
What's the balance between the rate of application versus how many years that person might have to go and reapply lime again?
That's also an excellent question. And there are a few factors here. I mentioned earlier the buffer capacity of that soil. Oftentimes, fine texture soils, we may need much higher rates of lime application, but we may not have to go back for, say, 10 years or more until we need to do more lime application. Again, on the flip side, those coarse texture soils, sandier soils, we may have to do more frequent liming just because, again, that buffer is much smaller. The other thing, too, is that something that becomes very important for us is what about placement in a way of that lime? And I'm talking about broadcast application on the surface for no-till versus incorporating that lime. And ideally, we want to incorporate lime. That's usually better if we can do that. So again, if we are planning ahead, for example, for alfalfa, where it's going to be a large investment, we need to, and if we have the possibility to incorporate, that will be better. But in no-till systems, we are not able to do that. Still, lime application provide benefits. The only factor here is that the rate of application will be lower because we're really just applying for the surface, say, about 3 inches, because that lime is going to be moving only the upper 3 inches of that soil. And so we're not really liming the 6-inch profile, we're only liming essentially 3 inches on the surface. And again, still provide the benefits, but we are obviously require basically half the rate in that case.
Dorivar, lime applications can be really expensive. So what is the benefit of going ahead and doing one?
That's an excellent question, Shelby. And one thing that we need to keep in mind about lime application is that it's not just something that will benefit the next crop, like it is for say, nitrogen or other nutrients. We're talking a long-term investment. And so the way to look at the economics here is really to look at the yield benefits that will happen in the next 10 years in many cases. So that's the way to look at it. If we look at some data in terms of the yield response to lime, oftentimes you look at that yield response and you say, well, that's not paying for lime for that lime application. But again, we cannot look at only one crop. We really need to be looking at multiple years. And again, the other aspect is, what about availability of other nutrients, and say phosphorus availability and other nutrients that are being improved when you have that good pH range. So there's many things there that maybe it's not as easy to measure in terms of yield response only.
You've mentioned alfalfa and wheat. What are some major differences then when it comes to lime applications?
Yes, that's a very good question. In the case of alfalfa, we are talking about legume crop, which is a lot more sensitive to low pH. And so typically we want to be targeting higher pH and maintaining higher pH in that case. Earlier, I mentioned a pH of 5.5 and lower. We have problems. That's typically for winter wheat. But if we're talking alfalfa, we're getting below 6. We're already seeing some issues. Because again, it is very sensitive. It's a legume. Nodulation is affected by this. And so again, alfalfa is very, very sensitive. We really need to pay more attention to that. And the same really goes for soybean, another legume as well. So if we do have soybean in the rotation, definitely we need to be paying more attention to pH.
Dorivar, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Thank you.
That was K-State Soil Fertility Specialist Dorivar Ruiz Diaz. There are a couple of agronomy e-update articles on this topic, which I will link in today's show notes on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be right back. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show discussing with another person who spoke at the HPJ Live Conference, Brian Arnall. Brian, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Shelby.
Brian, you are a Precision Nutrient Management Extension Specialist at Oklahoma State University, and your program title, Where to Cut Input Costs Without Losing Yield, and what inputs did you really look at?
Yeah, so really looked at in a winter wheat system as far as the seeding rate, nitrogen input, phosphorus, potassium, and sulfur.
Looking at if these input costs can be cut, and first, looking at seeding rate.
Yeah, and with recent work that we've really seen that as we move later in the season, historically, and I myself did this forever, I always bumped seeding rate. I'd start in October around 70 bushels when I first started 20 years ago, and I'm now down to 70 pounds. Now I'm down to about 60 pounds when I start. But by Thanksgiving, I'd be up to 2 bushel, that 120 pound rate, year in and year out. The recent work and the things we're seeing is that we don't get the benefit of more seeds later for grain-only wheat. And so really we're moving down. There's work that shows you can be as low as 60. I'm not comfortable with making that recommendation, but I'm definitely only into the 80-pound range, about 1 million seeds per acre as we move much later in the season. And I think we can get by with even a little bit less, especially if we have good sowing conditions.
So what is that combination of seeding rate and planting date?
You know, we used to always say that as you got later, it needed to be more and more seed as you got later because we're compensating for lack of tillering. We're finding the tillering isn't as critical even in high-yield components because our main tillers are the most important, the main tillers and secondary tillers. So as long as we have about 60 heads per square foot, which you could be as late, you say we may not tiller, then I need 60 seeds per square foot, we're able to maximize yield and 2 bushels, a lot more than that on the square footage. So the relationship that we thought was there isn't really panning out to be there as we thought it was.
Do we actually want more tillers?
With the work we're seeing, even in good conditions, the answer has been no. Under irrigated, you could have that conversation where we're trying to push 140, 150 bushel, but really anything in that 100 bushel or less, what we see is if we have more tillers that don't have the opportunity to fill, they are pulling so many resources away from the main tiller and the secondary tillers that we lose yield and we aren't able to fill the crop. And so what I talked about today is really treating wheat more like corn. We wouldn't drop 40,000 seeds per acre in dry land corn where we really need 20 because there's too much plant competition. And so in wheat, plants and tillers are both competition for the main. So we're needing to find that population like we do in corn, where we move from 18 or 20,000 in dry land to 32,000 irrigated because that's what the environment can support. We really should be thinking the wheat the same way. I want the right amount of head so that I fill the head from top to bottom. Just like corn, we don't want tip back. In corn, we don't want the heads not to fully fill in wheat. So let's fill up those heads because that's where the value is.
Thinking about planting day and competition and all those different things, in your presentation, talking a little bit about maybe later is not bad because there's less biomass?
Yeah, we've really, we started, when I started 20 years ago, we were in September through early October. We've now been moving to, I don't mind, mid-October and even November with the right genetics and sowing isn't bad. What gets us in dry land wheat is that we are so dependent on the right amount of moisture. And if we get dry at any point, it starts hurting us. Well, if we have more biomass, that's more water that is needed and more water that's been extracted. And so we find it a lot of value to not have a lot of biomass for grain only. Again, the grazers need that biomass, but for grain only, not having that biomass coming into the spring, where I used to want 70% row coverage going into the winter. I now want 30% row coverage coming out of winter.
Another big input, the different nutrients that could be being added in, and what did you focus on?
So we'll go first with phosphorus. It's one of those don't skimp. Make sure it's right, but soil test. If you miss it, and I didn't discuss this, but I had 5 questions after. If you miss the input of phosphorus because it got wet or your grain drill broke, we can top dress phosphorus and it works. On the nitrogen was the thing I hit the most. And talking about nitrogen input, I know anhydrous is cheap, and if I'm grazing, then I'm going to use it. I want that nitrogen up front. But there's very little evidence that I have is that upfront nitrogen, pre-plant nitrogen, has any benefit for grain-only wheat. I can even make split applied nitrogen work in my work for the last 15 years. So I want to move it, and really right now the price point from what I got quoted is about 30 cents difference between urea and anhydrous. At that 30 cent price gap, it's a wash on all my work on whether I go pre-plant or in season. The difference is at least in season nitrogen, I can adjust because of the weather. So if it hasn't rained or it has rained, I have more flexibility. When I write that check for anhydrous, it's done. I don't know what's happening after that.
What about sulfur?
We hear a lot more about sulfur. Shelby, you're wearing this pretty purple, and so K-State talks about sulfur with Dr. Dorivar, talks a lot about it. We have, in our deep sandy soils, an absolute need for sulfur. Good rainfall, deep sandy soils, I see sulfur. But in our silt loams, in our Oklahoma red dirt, we have so much sulfur sitting above that clay layer that we really may not need as much as we think. I'm finding in fields that have been growing great yields, 70 bushel wheat, 140 bushel corn, I'm still finding 20 to 30 pounds of sulfur to 1 foot deep. That's plenty for a wheat crop. So this year with nitrogen at 70 cents, anhydrous at 43 cents, sulfur's at 40 cents, I would recommend every producer to consider taking not just a 0 to 6 inch sample, but a 6 to 12. What's down there below, right above that clay layer? And you might be surprised how much nitrogen and sulfur is at that lower level.
And finally, potassium.
Potassium is one of those where we don't get the bang for our buck on wheat. Wheat's pretty efficient when it comes to potassium. But in the deep sandy soils that you leach K and you don't have the clay type to hold it, we do see more value with the potassium and the chloride. We also get a chloride bump in those soils. On K, if you think you need it, put out a strip in the fall. K can be top dressed. I'm side dressing a lot of my soybean and my cotton after I get a sense of the fill and rooting depth right now. We can do the same thing with wheat.
And within your presentation, made a note that maybe you do a little bit of sampling or turning things on and off in the field. Is that worth producers doing?
Oh, absolutely. Use your fields as a bit of a playground to see what works and not. So if I'm running pre-plant, just turn off that applicator for a second. Take a look at it, watch it as that base. Always check to see what we're doing. We have variety trials everywhere. We have hybrid trials everywhere where we're checking and testing hybrids. We need to be checking ourselves on fertility, which means an off and on or a 2X. Best case scenario, do an off, an on, and a 2X, and you'll know where you're sitting at all your inputs.
So, Brian, when we look at these different crops, do you see some value in letting them have a little bit of stress?
Yeah, we talk about that. Now, corn, it's scary, especially if I'm trying to push really high-yield irrigated corn. We're seeing the value. But we've got a lot of data for sorghum, cotton, and wheat that early season stress for wheat up through early spring, sorghum and cotton the first 2-3 weeks, a little water stress or a little nitrogen stress really lets our roots explore the soil volume more, keeps our plants a little more compact. On wheat, I get a lot less lodging if I can keep it more compact and smaller plant coming, and I can manage that by nitrogen. Same thing with cotton and sorghum. It allows me to get more rooting volume because that plant's looking for nitrogen, which means I get more water and nutrients from depth.
With the shorter plants, less chance of lodging?
Yeah, so if I can keep wheat shorter and honestly have less tillage, I tend to have a lot less lodging. So I've been able to go and work with folks, and we're getting 120 and 130, 140 bushel irrigated wheat, and really limit the lodging by moving all nitrogen into the spring and having very limited nutrients available pre-plant.
Do you see a lot of consistency or similarities for producers in Oklahoma and producers in Kansas being able to test these things?
Yeah, as far as the on-farm testing, everybody has the capability, and yield monitors are great, right? We should be using our yield monitors, and every farmer should be their own researcher. Every farmer has questions. Call an extension agent, call your area agronomist, whoever you have access to, and say, how can I test these things? Walk me through it, and it doesn't have to be scientific. It's just an on and off, and judge that. And in both locations, it's great.
What key points would you like to leave with our listeners?
If there's any opportunity to delay inputs so that you can get a sense of weather, do that. Meaning, delay nitrogen so we know what kind of a fall we have. Delay nitrogen so we see what kind of spring we have and make our adjustments. If you can put off input, especially nitrogen, so that you can get that rate right, there's a lot of value in that. And seeding rate, more is not always best, and same thing, nitrogen early, more is not always best.
Brian, if people have questions about what you've mentioned today in today's show, can they reach out to you?
Absolutely. A couple different methods to get a hold of me. One, if you don't even remember my name, Google OSU N, and K, like nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. We have a blog. We have all kinds of social media. That's how you can contact me that way. Or email me. My email is b.arnall@okstate.edu.
Brian, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Thank you so much, Shelby.
That was Precision Nutrient Management Extension Specialist from Oklahoma State University, Brian Arnall. I will link the resources that he mentioned in today's show notes on agtoday.net. If you have questions for Brian, you can reach out to him yourself at his email address, which is b.arnall@okstate.edu. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be right back.
This is Agriculture Today. Along with Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. For the August K-State Garden Hour, K-State professor and extension specialist of ornamental nursery crop production and marketing, Cheryl Boyer, along with several colleagues, discussed their recent and emerging horticultural research. Boyer says that her three areas of focus are production, culture, and use of ornamental nursery crops, new media marketing and e-commerce for horticultural businesses, and scholarship of extension.
On the nursery crop side, I still do a little bit of work with alternative potting materials or substrates as they're known. There's integrated pest management work that is part of that process. Also, we do a lot of surveying things. And so we've investigated what practices that nursery growers do and what their barriers are, what their challenges are, how we can help them figure things out. So for example, nursery industry practices, we recently published a paper on the drivers of native plant production. There's a lot of interest in native plants, and they're not always abundantly available in the garden center. And there are reasons for that from the production side. So we're able to sort of investigate those, find out what those barriers are, and try to help mitigate and provide solutions so that we can have greater access to those plants that are desired by consumers. I also do work with consumer preferences. So a couple years ago, we had a project looking at a plant that was a bulb, the Achaemenes project, and we looked at consumer preferences for that plant and whether or not it was useful in the landscape. Turns out it's not so great, which is an answer. Sometimes the results maybe aren't what you hoped they were, but they're still an answer. So we know to tell you not to waste your money on that plant, but it's a pretty good house plant. I also was able to collaborate on a project in the landscape architecture department where we investigated consumer preferences for naturalistic landscape styles. On the marketing side, I work in new media marketing and e-commerce. So we try to understand the barriers to adoption of digital technologies. A lot of people who get into horticulture get into it because they like growing things and getting their hands dirty, and it's not necessarily their favorite activity to be on the computer. And so we try to help them curate that content and make it easier and more efficient for them so that they can be smart about how they spend their time and how they can access resources to help them be more successful in those realms that may not be their favorite wheelhouse. As part of that, we identify best practices for social media, new media marketing, and then try to understand consumer preferences. What will consumers respond to in a social media marketing post, for example? Are they driven by price or by the presence of people in the photo or just communication, the messages? That has been a collaboration with ag communication and ag economics. I like to collaborate broadly and get people to help me figure things out for the skill set that I don't have. I was trained on how to grow plants and how to measure them and how to kill them and measure them some more, and not necessarily how to do a survey and how to figure out a return on investment. So we collaborate broadly within our institution and outside of our institution to find solutions for those challenges that we may be not best equipped for. Also do a fair bit of scholarship of extension, which looks like programming. So needs assessment, program evaluation, all those emails that you get about Garden Hour are coming from me. So you can blame me if you get too many, but the program evaluation for this and the long-term one that we do later in the fall. And that is a collaboration with all of our extension professionals all across the state. So this is our program that we do together, and we learn how to navigate those systems so that we can help figure out if we're spending our time on the right things and really making a difference for the state of Kansas. So also use of our extension learning resources, digital tools for extension programming, evaluating those are all things that I am interested in from both an extension and a research perspective. And I have two students. So Alex Stanton is a PhD student. He is working in landscape management. Drought mitigation is a particular focus of his project. And he's also very interested in extension scholarship. So how are industry and homeowners, consumers, using the extension resources that we create to help you make better decisions. And then Lily Nelson is a master's student, and she's going to work on horticulture and natural resources needs assessment and evaluating our alumni to figure out how we can do things better and to help us work on student recruiting and new media marketing for our department.
That's K-State professor and extension specialist of ornamental nursery crop production and marketing, Cheryl Boyer. To listen to the full webinar, search for K-State Garden Hour and click on Most Recent Webinars. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.